Good afternoon. First, I would like to thank our distinguished hosts for bringing us all together. It's a great pleasure to be here and be part of the conversation today. I think every time people hear fair fashion and hear sustainability, they think I've come to ask you all to wear organic t-shirts, which is not the case. Actually, what I want to talk about is two hows. As we're talking about the conference today on climate how, I'd like to share two learnings from the Fair Fashion Center. The first is how to engage with the private sector, which is always a big question. How do we get CEOs and companies to move forward? So I'm going to share a bit of our experience with the fashion CEOs. And the second is how to scale systems change through cross-sector collaborations and collective impact. So these will be my two hows. So I'm going to start with a quote from Nobel laureate Professor Yunus, who many of you will know through his work in microlending, the chancellor of the university that houses the Fair Fashion Center. He said, "Fashion has always influenced more than itself." I think this is important because fashion is probably the only industry really hardwired for dramatic and rapid change. We deliver 12 collections of clothing per year, so we are always reinventing ourselves, which makes it easy as an industry to introduce change. I think it's also important always to remember that fashion reflects and drives cultural influence. When we're talking about how to rebrand sustainability and get consumers as well to engage in this as a topic, very critical to understand sustainability cannot look like a bucket of difficult problems, but rather many different opportunities. Second quote I'm going to start with is from one of the smartest women that I know. She always used to say, "It's helpful to start with the facts, dear." That's my mom. So on the facts, fashion is a $2.5 trillion industry. We are responsible for 20% industrial wastewater. We are responsible for 10% carbon emissions. We have 80% women in our supply chain. I'm sure all fashion companies would love to say we sell through 100% of what we make. If we sell through 80%, we are lucky. 20% of merchandise and packaging hits landfill year on year. So you can imagine the impacts that we are actually having. When I talk about fashion, as I said, I would like that you please do not think only, as it says there, about fashion. If you unpack what the fashion industry is, this is what fashion is. We saw a lot of these industries being named this morning, but these are the sub-industries that drive fashion, from manufacturing to regenerative agriculture, chemicals, energy, transportation, built environment, and so on. Also the power of marketing and celebrity, as I said, to rebrand, obviously social labor and stakeholder well-being, governance, and transparency. So I think we've moved away from the organic t-shirt question. I'm showing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure in this crowd nobody really actually needs to see because we're all very aware of them. However, I'll make a confession. I used to be a fashion industry CEO. Around the time that these goals came forward, which are an amazing North Star and an agenda for all of us, as a CEO, I looked at them and felt, it's a bit abstract. I'm being called on to be a corporate statesman, and I don't really know what to do. I don't understand the tactics and the how-tos behind this. Fashion, unfortunately, hits 17 out of the 17 goals. Yes, so even if we talk about oceans and life below water, unfortunately, our microplastics are becoming more and more into the conversation. So unfortunately, we are involved here across the board. Also, as a CEO, we started to look at science when we were starting the Fair Fashion Center that I now run. Same story here. If I was a CEO looking at the planetary boundaries, I would have no idea what it was that I was actually being called on to do. From there, we started to look at the nonprofit world, and there is some inherent conflict between for-profit and not-for-profit worlds. And often, particularly in the fashion area, what we found is each nonprofit is focused on one specific issue. That may be slave labor, that may be greenhouse gases, that may be cotton and regenerative farming. So each one has a little bit of the puzzle, again, as a company, without the internal skill set to make judgments on those things. It's very difficult to understand how to align yourself. We work with a lot of CEOs, one who says, I have no VP of greenhouse gases, and I don't have a director of carbon emissions, and I also don't have anybody that's leading the team on wastewater. There are no biologists generally in fashion, only Gucci Group has one. There are no people that actually, as I said, inside the companies can deal with what they're being asked to deal with today. Government also are making policies. I wish often they would be making different policies. Would be fantastic if we could have the idea that sustainable products should have lower duties. Instead, just talking about America, the more chemicals you spray on things to make them waterproof, the lower your duties are. So I'm going to come a little bit into finance. That motivates my crowd. When I talk about my crowd, I mean CEOs that run fashion companies. The more that we all got schooled at the Fair Fashion Center on what is on the Bloomberg terminals in regard to environmental, social, and governance, what are they tracking? Everybody will know probably Larry Fink from BlackRock. We joke in New York that he owns 7% of everything. The more that Larry Fink is asking us to pay attention to environmental, social, and governance, asking for progress on those key areas, and Bloomberg is making that visible, I think the more that companies are motivated. It creates a bit of a domino effect. As investors lean on CEOs to do better, CEOs engage more in the supply chain. The more the supply chain is greener and cleaner, the more they report to CEOs, and the more CEOs have good news also for the investment community. I know that we're going to hear today from Georg Kell and Arabesque on all of the amazing work that they are doing to make this transparent to investors. Super key here. Last thing I'll say about that is Bloomberg is scraping tweets, articles, Instagrams. They are mapping people's supply chain and overlaying it with water-stressed areas. They are overlaying it with areas of geopolitical risks. The more the investors say, hey, company X, you're growing a third of your cotton in a water-stressed area, and that's my business, people need to react to that. Super important here, but even these folks speak a different language than industry speaks. So what we found when we were launching the Fair Fashion Center is that there is what we call an in-between space. If we're looking at industry and the language of fashion and delivering and marketing and buying and selling product, and then we look at finance that's talking about blended financing mechanisms in ESG and this kind of a thing, and science with science-based targets and the planetary boundaries, academia, its language, government another, philanthropy another, nonprofits another, it became difficult again for CEOs to become those corporate statesmen. So when we talk about how today, I just want to go into a little bit where we are, which is we decided to try to bring all of those people a half step in, translate the languages of each, and deliver it back to the CEOs in forms of practical business solutions that they could actually incorporate, being sure that we hit in the crosshairs profitability and sustainability and the aversion of material business risk. The Fair Fashion Center now works with 40 CEOs. We represent 242 brands. They work in 102 countries. Obviously, our supply chain is quite complicated and global, working across governments. They have 41,000 facilities among them, and they represent $260 billion in turnover, which is about 12% of the global industry. When you get those people in one room, alone with no handlers, and they're not allowed to bring anybody with them, and it's run like a boardroom, all of the real issues bubble up, and a lot of the real solutions then come forward, because all of those cross-sector collaborations, I said, lots of people like to turn out when they hear 12% of a private sector industry is together in one room and asking and looking to be facilitated. I don't want to oversimplify, obviously, but in particular, where fashion's main impacts are in our raw materials, two areas there, obviously row crops, cotton, and so on, manufacturing, uplifting livelihoods, trash, and I'm not going to take much time here, just in the interest. As I said, we work on profit-making activities, identifying actionable solutions, and the second how is I'd like to talk about one of them. We're working on a double impact initiative that addresses the fashion industry's social and environmental challenges, and I'm going to just show you a 2-minute film and bring to a close where is the how on systems change through collective action.
$5 trillion industry. Fashion is one of the most polluting, with estimates that it contributes 10% of carbon emissions and 20% of industrial wastewater. Women make up 75% of the supply chain. So how do we meet the challenges facing fashion, improve livelihoods in the supply chain, and reduce environmental impact, all while maintaining margins? Introducing NOCO, a GCNYC Fair Fashion Center initiative that addresses the agricultural, industrial, and social impacts of the business. Here's how it works. While checking out online or in store, customers can choose to round up their purchase to the nearest dollar, effectively saying, keep the change to help offset the impact of my purchase. The brand or retailer collects these customer donations, as well as some big data regarding which customers are interested in going green. These funds are combined with corporate donations, private foundation support, and investment capital to create an innovative, blended finance mechanism that will scale the initiative. Beyond simply planting trees or other methods of offsetting, we can reach back into our very own supply chain to address the impacts that fashion creates in the first place. By taking the funds collected and retrofitting factories with rooftop solar panels or nearby ground arrays, we could transform manufacturing, remediating its impact on people and the planet directly at the source. Factories are converted to renewable energy using none of their own capital. A power purchase agreement, PPA, guarantees a lower priced and more stable supply of electricity, while removing the risks of diesel and other dangerous polluting energy sources, as well as an often inconsistent grid supply. The savings generated by the PPA is shared, redistributed in parts as lower energy costs for the factory owner, a significant social program fund for the workers and community, and a return for investors. In support of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, NOCO could fund programs selected by the workers, such as establishing water treatment plants in wastewater areas where they live, creating better factory conditions, providing educational opportunities to navigate life both at work and at home, or simply to pay increased wages. The factory owner is incentivized by reducing operating costs. Workers are engaged to raise the standards of living in the community, and brands mitigate material business risks and create long-term collaborative relationships with suppliers. The factory itself is environmentally greener, socially more responsible, and a better partner for brands to choose. Everybody wins. But that's only a start. As we consider fashion's raw materials, from leather to cotton, NOCO could fund projects that could reduce chemical usage, improve biodiversity, sequester carbon, and regenerate the agriculture so vital to maintaining balance in our ecosystem. The project is in collaboration with the Rockefeller Foundation, independently audited for transparency, confirming laborers are protected and the agreements made are honored. And the whole process propagates itself going forward. A new system has been created. Business becomes the instrument that solves the world's problems. Customers, stores, factories, and farms work together to make a greater fashion industry that respects and supports the environment and its workforce, recognizing we are one human family with one common planet. NOCO, a GCNYC Fair Fashion Center initiative, proving the business case for sustainability.
So I'm going to close now because I know I'm over time. I just think that it's important to recognize these cross-sector collaborations are a labor of love. If everybody doesn't step into the middle, that took a lot of people to put together into what is a business solution. We've done a feasibility study actually with Alex Voigt that you'll hear from later, looking at over 120 different facilities and so on. So happy to take questions and be around for anybody during the break.
Yeah, we're quite short on time, but we can take one quick question. Just, it's really interesting that, you know, fashion as such a consumer brand, you're really making it very approachable for society.
So it's always very interesting to see this kind of perspective, but my reaction is it looks like a win-win-win-win-win-win solution. So there must be something that stops this kind of phenomenon to happen everywhere. So there should be a strong inertia in the system. So what is your experience about that?
That's an interesting question. I think that there is a strong inertia and these things should happen. I think what happens is people have good ideas. To take a good idea actually and realize the systems change is a long road to travel. And very often the funding and the ownership of the problem and generating that solution belong to nobody. So it's not Rockefeller Foundation that should jump forward to Macy's and say, oh, hey, can we help you with your supply chain? It's not Macy's that has the ability to understand renewable energy. So who actually owns the problem? Then it's kind of nobody owns the problem, so that means nobody really owns driving the systems change solution. And once we figured it out, to find funding to do a feasibility study, which sounds ridiculous, it's very little money, but that is like, oh, well, gee, are we helping business? Oh no, is business just the instrument? So I think there's a little bit of a complication in getting the world's resources together to say that can really scale, and it truly is, as far as we know, still a win-win-win, but it takes the funding of good ideas to bring them to a point that people can actually engage with them.
Thank you so very much, Cara. And what's really exciting about that is showing that businesses take responsibility for their whole supply chain, that they show leadership within that. So moving right along, I would like to welcome Paul Jeffries. If Paul could come up and join us and talk to us a little bit about BP and their plan to transition to a low-carbon business. Paul is the head of policy at BP. Thank you for joining us.
Sure. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Paul Jeffries. I'm the head of policy at BP. And first of all, I want to thank the organizers and say it's a really great pleasure to be back at the Symposium. And I usually say that at the start of a conference, and I don't always mean it. But on this occasion, I really do. Now, today I'm going to focus specifically on two aspects of what BP is doing to contribute to the energy transition, which is to improve the products that we provide to customers and to create new products and businesses. But before I do that, I just wanted to touch briefly on BP's history of engagement with climate change, because I think it's important. We began over 2 decades ago now, when our chief executive was the first to acknowledge publicly that climate change is an important issue justifying urgent action, which was groundbreaking back in 1997. And we have been on a journey ever since. We have advocated and used carbon pricing consistently throughout that period. We've invested significantly in renewable energy. But in particular, I wanted to draw your attention to a couple of announcements we made just last Friday, one of which was that for the first time, 36,000 BP staff worldwide will now have part of their reward determined by our meeting or not meeting greenhouse gas emissions target, which is significant. And the second significant announcement was that our board has decided to support a shareholder resolution which calls on us to describe how our strategy, our major capital investments, and our metrics and targets are consistent with meeting the Paris goals. So 2 significant announcements just like last Friday. So one of the ways we plan to contribute to the energy transition, we introduced last year, we call it our Reduce, Improve, and Create, or our RIC frame. The reduce part is about reducing emissions in our own operations. The improve part is about improving the products that we sell to customers. And the third part is about creating new products and new businesses. I'm going to focus today just on improving and creating. I don't want to minimize the importance of the reduce part, and we're doing a very great deal in the reduce part of the framework, but I'm going to focus on the I and the C, and I'll explain to you exactly why. I don't know if it'll surprise anyone in this room, but it often surprises people, that in the life cycle of oil and gas products, only 10 to 20% of the emissions associated with the production and use of that product comes from the production and manufacturing side, 10 to 20. So this big set of activities on the left here, this account for only 10 to 20% of emissions. The set of activities at this end around using the products accounts for 80 to 90%. So that is you and me, all of us, flying, driving, heating, lighting. So that means that it's customer emissions where the big gains are likely to be made. And why at a conference on how we can make a big difference, I wanted to focus on those two elements. So, first of all, if I look at our improve activities, this gives you 8 different examples, and I'll highlight just a few of them, of ways in which we're improving our customer products. Part of it is about improving our fuels and lubricants so that they are used more efficiently. So, for example, our Castrol oils are used in Ford's EcoBoost engines in Europe, and we estimated that in 2017 that saved about 340,000 tons of carbon dioxide. Some of these examples are about using renewable or waste feedstocks in place of conventional petrochemical feedstocks. So, for example, we are now the largest producer of renewable gas for fuel for transport in the US, and we use agriculture and food waste to do that. We have a company called Fulcrum, and that actually takes household waste, municipal solid waste, and converts it, believe it or not, into jet fuel. One of our focus areas has been aviation fuels, partly because aviation emissions are rising rapidly, partly because they've set targets which are quite challenging, and partly because there are very few alternatives in the aviation sector to lower emissions. So we're now supplying biojet to some of the Scandinavian airports and to some of the airline manufacturers like Airbus and Bombardier. We're using more efficient manufacturing processes, particularly in our petrochemicals businesses, bringing some of them down by as much as 30% in terms of their carbon footprint. We're combining more efficient projects with opportunities to offset, to be able to market truly carbon neutral products. So some of our Castrol range is literally carbon neutral through the use of offsetting. We have a program called Target Neutral that allows customers to purchase offsets for their own fuel emissions if they choose. And finally, we have a strong focus for various reasons on reducing plastic packaging. This is just a whistle-stop tour, as you can imagine. Focusing on the create side, new businesses, first of all, I draw your attention to our expansion of our existing significant renewable energy businesses. We have 5 of those. We are the largest operator of renewable energy amongst our peers. The first I'll draw your attention to is our biofuels business. It's 3 global scale sugarcane to ethanol plants in Brazil. And they're producing around 750 million litres of ethanol a year, and that's increased by about 40% over the last 4 years. We have a renewable products business. We have a renewable products business, and this is partly about new kinds of renewable fuels, and particularly we have a JV with DuPont to produce biobutanol, which is a more energy-dense sort of form of ethanol, which is more compatible with conventional engines. But we're also producing more bioproducts generally, bioplastics, biolubricants, and so on. Up here we have a biopower business, which uses the waste from our ethanol plants to generate power, both for BP's own use and to sell into the grid. We have a substantial onshore wind business in the US, 1.8 gigawatts over 11 sites, looking to expand that. And last year went into a venture with Tesla to provide low-carbon power storage in South Dakota, for example. But the business I'd like to draw your attention to most is solar energy, where we have expanded most in the recent past. Historically, BP was investing in manufacturing solar panels, retailing them. This business, it's a $200 million investment in a utility-scale solar company, which provides very large-scale solutions at a grid level. At the moment, 2.2 gigawatts under management. We have an ambition of 8 gigawatts of solar by 2022 by expanding in big sunny countries like Brazil, India, Australia, the US, Egypt, and so on. Just sort of moving on very quickly to another aspect of our CREATE framework. This is about creating new businesses through venturing. Historically, BP invested at large scale in a relatively few technologies that were well understood. Now, some of those technologies were successful, and they are the renewable businesses I showed you in the previous slide. Some of them were not successful, but even those taught us lessons. And the lessons they taught us, or an important one, was that at least as a start, it's prudent to invest on a smaller scale across a wide array of technologies. So not just renewables, but across the broad spectrum of energy, looking, for example, at digital energy, at low carbon storage and power, at sustainable mobility, at bioproducts, at environmental products of all kinds. And just to give you a few examples of what we're doing, artificial intelligence companies allowing us to cut the time for processing data by about 90%. A $10 million investment in a Chinese fund to develop new energy vehicles as part of their energy ecosystem. So a number of small-scale venturing technologies, around 450 million ventured so far. But if they are successful, then we can scale up and bring them into the mainstream of our alternative energy businesses. And just to close with a focus on one particular area where we're focused, which is electrification, sustainable mobility, and particularly fast charging. A major investment recently was 130 million into ChargeMaster, which is the UK's largest electric vehicle charging network, which we can deploy into around 1,200 petrol retail stations in the UK, capable of generating a 100-mile range in around 10 minutes of charging. We're looking at another company called StoreDot, an ultra-fast battery charging company, looking at recharging EV batteries in about 5 minutes. So really trying to move the dial on electric vehicles. Another company, FreeWire, which is a mobile electric vehicle charging. And then finally, we've made some investments in China in particular, and just recently opened our first EV charging station in China with a company called 66i Fuel. So apologies for kind of rattling through that, but it hopefully gave you a flavor of BP's interest in the customer side of emissions. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Paul. I'd like to open it up for questions. What really struck me was that you are focusing on the customer, and that is helping you shift away from fossil fuels to becoming more of a holistic energy company. Very exciting stuff. A question up front here?
Hi, Jessica from Eco Business. Paul, sorry to put you on the spot a little bit, but you were talking about customers using 80 to 90% of your emissions, but isn't that shifting the blame to consumers a little? Because any sensible customer today, if you say, do you want to use clean energy? They would say yes, but it's not available to them. So it's actually up to the corporations and the energy majors to give them that choice, and they don't have that choice yet. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Shall I answer that question?
Yeah, absolutely.
My answer would be that I don't think it's helpful to blame anyone. You know, it's a systemic problem in which there are multiple actors who have to play their part. From our point of view, from the customer's point of view, it's the energy companies. From the energy companies' point of view, it is policymakers. You know, we, along with our peers, have been arguing vociferously for a carbon price, but we have been disappointed at the pace at which carbon pricing is deployed. And the reason why that is important is that without clear policy signals for companies to act, it is very difficult to invest very far ahead of the curve. I mean, we can certainly make incremental steps in the right direction, but at the end of the day, we are responsible to shareholders, and we have to be careful to make sure that we're not over-investing or investing too fast in a direction that policymakers are not going to follow. And I think looking back over BP's history of engagement in this space, I think a strong argument could be made that 20 years ago, we overestimated the pace at which the world would take climate seriously. And we made, as I said, some big investments in renewable energy that were arguably premature. We invested over $8 billion between 2005 and 2015. And only some of those investments have been profitable. Now, as I say, we have benefited from the learning from that, but it's very difficult to leap far forward into the future with the best will in the world without incurring a certain amount of risk. So I'm not trying to shift the blame entirely. What I'm trying to say is that it has to be a collaborative effort between policymakers, corporations, and society as a whole. And society can certainly indicate their preferences, by choosing alternative products, many of which still, for the time being, do cost a little bit more. That's just the hard reality. Those costs are coming down, but for the time being, in most cases, there is a premium to pay. And if customers can show the willingness to pay that, then obviously corporations can respond more quickly.
So a big support for price on carbon. One more question, please.
Thank you so much for this really interesting presentation. It's the first time I'm really impressed by BP.
The first time you're impressed?
Yeah.
Right.
So, yeah, completely different picture now. Congratulations on working so hard to get the company really green and not just the logo. My name is Irene Hell. I run the press agency, Irene Hell News, and a journalist network called Friends in Media. And I report for Copenhagen Post. You said something really, really interesting, something about a bonus. So does your CEO only get money when he's carbon neutral, or can you tell me a little bit more about this bonus system you installed?
No, part of the annual bonus for 36,000 of our employees, including executive directors, will be partly determined by whether or not we meet one of the targets that we have set under the reduce part of our framework that I didn't refer to, is to achieve 3.5 million tons of real reductions between 2015 and 2025. And it will be whether or not that target is met that will partly determine a portion of the bonus.
Is it working? Is it an incentive? Is it changing the way you operate now? So
it was only announced on Friday. So to be honest, this was news to BP staff. So I don't know the answer yet.
Okay, we've got briefly half a minute, if you could keep it short.
Paul, one quick question on innovation. What are you most excited about in your innovation pipeline that could really change the percentage of your energy mix towards renewables?
Gosh. I mean, this isn't a corporate view. It's my own view. It's probably the power of digital technology because it has applications across the spectrum. It affects the efficiency with which we do business really in just about all aspects of the value chain. So I think it will create opportunities that we don't even understand at the moment. So I was pointing to the possibility of a 90% time reduction in data acquisition and processing in our upstream, for example, where you have billions of data points needed to process for seismic imaging, for example. So those kinds of efficiencies are potentially, I think, enormous.
Thank you so very much, Paul. That was a very inspiring presentation. So we've heard from the fashion industry and the energy industry. Now we're going to look a little bit into the food industry. I'd like to welcome Henrik Madsen. Thank you for joining us. Henrik is the chairman of the Norwegian Research Council and the former president and CEO of DNV, the CL Group, who we've heard from before. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, so we heard about the fashion industry. Italians are passionate about fashion. We're also passionate about food. So I will talk about opportunities from the ocean for the food industry. And this will be in a climate and greenhouse gas perspective. We could take many other perspectives. First, a few numbers. So livestock accounts for some 15% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. If you take the whole food industry, if say from farm to fork, maybe the number is 30%. But just focusing here on livestock, 65% comes from cattle. This is expected to grow a lot, 54% towards 2050 for meat and 73% for milk. So you can see this is not sustainable. There's no way that we can allow that or it can happen. So the question is, are there better sources of animal protein than from cattle? You can also say sheep, goats, pigs, and chicken in a greenhouse gas context. So this is really the question. So let me just show you something about which animals are best at producing or to grow on the amount of on feed. So cattle, you need 4 to 10 kilo of feed to make 1 kilo of animal of a cow. 4 to 10 depends on the feed. Pork is 3, chicken is 2.2, and the farmed salmon is 1.1. So it's very, very efficient. So why is it so efficient? Well, it doesn't emit any methane. And secondly, it doesn't keep 37 degrees. And it doesn't spend energy standing on 2 or 4 legs, just to make it very simple. But it's surprising in terms of efficiency that fish are much more efficient than the livestock. Also, when it comes to salmon, it's the highest percentage of the animal that's being eaten, 61%, and the rest is really recycled. So there's a very good circular economy argument here. If we take the whole chain, say from farm to fork, then these are some numbers from Denmark. You can see similar numbers from other parts of the world. So don't look so much at the absolute value, but more on the relative value, because that's very stable. So beef has a much bigger CO2 emission or CO2 equivalent, because it's not so much CO2, it's more methane and nitrogen oxides. Pork is next. Lamb is like beef. Chicken is better. Cheese and butter is also bad. So on the right-hand side, you see vegetable, fruits, and whole grain much lower. So if we were all vegans, it would be much, much easier, but I think many of us still like to have some alternatives. And then moving to the ocean, to the left we have seafood from the ocean. Also you see very good numbers compared to livestock on land. But the unfortunate thing is that we have already overfished what is wild in the ocean, so we cannot increase that production. And then to the right we have aquaculture, the trout, which is mainly farmed on land, and the salmon, which is farmed mainly in the ocean. And you see these numbers also very attractive compared to meat, but of course not as attractive as the grains and the vegetables and so on. But fish farming is growing, and the question is, can it really be sustainable? I know more about what happens in Norway than in Asia, but the biggest aquaculture industry is clearly in Asia. But I think for the people we want to persuade to maybe eat less meat and more fish, they would be more looking to the fish that is produced in Northern Europe, Norway, Scotland, and so on. So Norway produces about more than 1 million tons of salmon per year. It is kind of 1 meal per person in the world per year. And it's done mainly in sheltered waters. And there are clearly limitations to grow the industry in that manner. So we see now 2 mega trends to multiply production in a sustainable manner. One is to move to land-based facilities. It's RAS facilities, so you have recirculating aquaculture systems on land. And if you do that, you can have fish farming in China and the United States. You can have it many places. So then you will also save a lot of energy for the transportation. Or you move the sites further offshore. So So I'll show you a few pictures on that. This is how a traditional offshore fish farm looks in Norway. So here you may produce, let's say, 5,000 tons of salmon a year, so it's certainly a significant amount. But moving on land, so this is a picture from Denmark. So this is not a pig farm or chicken farm, it's actually a fish farm on land. So on this farm, it is like the prototype, it produces, I think, 1,200 tons of something that's called kingfish yellowfin. I think it's a sushi fish per year, and in such a recirculable system. And of course, these you can build anywhere in the world. So the challenge will be to have the technology and the biology working together. Technologically, it's not difficult, but you also have to have the biology to go your way, and there are new challenges there. So my education is a structural engineer, so I like maybe more the structures we can put further offshore. I'll show you this one. So now we talk real structures. On the left, you see when the structure was transported from the Chinese yard to Norway, and to the right you see it installed in the water. So it has been through 1 year, and the fish will stay in the net for 1 year. And the first slaughtering of fish took place in August, and they can have 1 million fish in that net. So 6,000 tons of 6,000 tons of salmon. So this is real. This is not science fiction. This is actually happening. This is another one. This vessel is also being built in China. It will be probably in operation in Norway in a year from now. This is how it looks. So again, it's a real structure. Then Norway has had, the Norwegian government introduced a competition to have more sustainable solutions, and a lot of wonderful ideas came out. This one will also has now a permission to operate in Norway. So this will be built. And you see this is a closed system, so you don't have any residues from food or excrement from the fish going out. This is a submerged one called Atlantis, of course. And there's also a dome so the fish can come up and get some air. Aquatras, so I don't think the fish can escape from here. This will also be built. One thing I personally like is to also look at, can we convert some existing structures? And I personally think to convert some large bulk carriers has a big potential. On such an old bulk carrier, you have about 200,000 cubic meters of cargo area that you can produce fish in. So, in terms of building structures that can withstand the oceans far from shore, there are huge opportunities. The next thing I want to address quickly is feed, because I mean we as people, and the same with the fish and the animals, they are what they eat. And again, some numbers. 75% of the agricultural area is used for animal production, including feed production. 75%. So my home country, Denmark, has 6 million people, but we have 30 million pigs. And the amount, and we are imported from South America, the area in South America that's used to grow this soya, it corresponds to our biggest island, Zealand, where we have the capital of Copenhagen. It's grotesque, if you ask me. One thing that's probably surprising for you is that farmed salmon also is mainly fed on soya. So with soya, you have the choice you can have. Do you want soya as a tofu, as a pig's meat, or as chicken meat, or as a salmon meat? I mean, what do you want? So we need to, change that. And farmed salmon used to have a lot more fish meal and the fish oil in the feed. You can have more of that by using more krill. But if you go to more and more soya, of course, you get less omega-3 and more omega-6, so it's not good for your health. So today you need to eat twice as much salmon to get the same amount of omega-3 as 10 years ago. So, but there are solutions for that. We could grow the feed in the ocean. Sugar tongue, I had to get the translation, but I know the Norwegian word. But it's a seaweed. That can be a solution. It can be produced industrially in the ocean. Oops. Are we coming back? Well, there are many pilot installations, and there's still some work to be done to reduce the amount of energy you need, for instance, for drying. Contrary to growing soya, which uses a lot of phosphor and nitrogen, these seaweeds, they absorb actually phosphor and nitrogen from the ocean. And a thing that surprised me is they absorb CO2 at the same level as a rainforest. So 1 square meter of these absorb as much CO2 as a rainforest. But you can harvest these once or twice a year. You can't harvest a rainforest more than once, basically. They can also be used for production of biofuels. They're more efficient than sugarcane or corn or whatever you want to use. And there are some very nice trials now where you do fish farming, mussel production, and seaweed production together. Because then whatever is spilled from the fish farm is used to grow the mussels and the seaweed. The mussels are harvested. The food can be fish food. The CO2 is stored in the shells and so on. So these combinations are also very promising. So this is a seaweed. So to the right, you see the lady is holding this. Yeah. It took 4.5 months to grow the seaweed to this size. So it grows very, very fast. Marine algae is another solution, and we have only really studied a very, very small part of the marine algae. We've tested to do biofuels with them, but of course marine algae, if you can grow at large scale, can be fish food, it can be human food, and it absorbs a lot of CO2, and there are some really nice pilot projects in Norway and elsewhere where you use CO2 from smelters to increase the growth rate of the algae. So just to conclude, I hope what you said back with is that the ocean space, I think we really don't know, we don't think about all the opportunities with the ocean space, but it's very important to create solutions for sustainability. And we can produce a lot more healthy and sustainable food and feed from the ocean. And I think we should increase the amount of fish in our diets a lot. It's fine if we all go vegans, but if we want more variety, eat more fish and farmed fish, both fresh and frozen. And so the question, I guess, what we'll discuss tomorrow is how to do that, how to speed it up. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much. So you've heard it. Let's go vegan. If not, have salmon on your plate. A few questions from the audience.
Thank you. I'm curious that you just mentioned offshore fish farms, and I want to ask, does it have any negative impact on the marine ecosystems or food chain?
Well, the limitation that you now see in Norway and Scotland and other places with the fish farms close to shore is that there will be some pollution because the fish eat most of the feed, but a little bit will slip through, and also they have excrements of different types. So that may affect the local environment. If you move further offshore, it will just be, the concentration will be so small. But even offshore, I think you will see more closed systems where you actually take care of all of it because it's a resource. You can make biogas to maybe fuel the installation. So there's an interest to have to let nothing is emitted in the ocean.
Well, thank you so very much.
Yeah, thank you.
And you've really put a spotlight on utilizing the ocean environment in a way that we haven't heard before. Thank you. And it'll be interesting to also see the carbon absorption potential of the oceans and some of these and how that might fit into future IPCC modeling. But maybe that's a discussion for tomorrow. So next up, I'd like to welcome Jerome Schmidt. Jerome is the Executive Committee Chairman. Welcome. For the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. And you're going to be talking to us a little bit about how the oil and gas industry can help build a decarbonized future and how they can accelerate that.
Thank you very much. I hope I will be able to. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me this morning. I'm very grateful. It's a great opportunity to be sharing both experience and perspective. The first thing I would like to say is I'm also very grateful to Bjorn and Paul from Equinor and BP, because not only they are great leaders and their company are great leaders of GCI and on climate, but I mean, you know, they have done something else this morning, which is when you are an oil and gas company invited into a climate change conference, you are a little bit like a rabbit invited at a hunter's party. And when you are that rabbit invited at a hunter's party on an island with no escape boat, it's as if you were committing suicide. So they survived up to now. Hopefully I will too. So let's try. So let us talk a little bit, and I will try not to bother you too much about GCI itself, but more about what are our convictions. For those who don't know, GCI has been created in September 2014, just a year ahead of COP21 in New York at the UN during the climate summit. It was launched by the then CEO of Saudi Aramco, Khaled Al-Faleh, who is now the Minister of Petroleum of Saudi Arabia. And it's not, I think it's important to say this because it means something. And GCI is now made of 13 companies representing about 30% of the global oil and gas production and about 20% of the global energy supply demand. So it's quite significant, and whatever we do, we can have an impact together. What is very important, as the first representation we had, is that it is CEO-led. And the CEOs of GCI, who are led by Bob Dudley, the chairman of the CEO of BP today, meet about eight times a year on a GCI to determine the direction, to basically try to decide together where we can go and what we can achieve and what we can push as an agenda, as an industry together on climate. And it's very important because when you are CEO-led, it means you can drive and give an impulsion and you can influence everywhere what you do. And here, I think I would like to highlight three things I've heard this morning, which are quite important. Why GCI? Because not only each of the companies here needs to work, but we need to work together. When you lead alone, you cannot lead that long. Generally, you don't survive. You need a first follower, a second follower. You need to be a group moving together. This point was made very cleverly by Paul. The second point is that you need to have visions. And you need to have visions that can be transformed into business opportunities. And in the 21st century, CEOs who have a vision that can be transformed into a business opportunity generally have a vision which is linked to decarbonization. And both go together. And Timothy, you made that point very clearly this morning. You introduced to us an incredible correlation between decarbonization and value creation. And I think the GCI company CEO have understood that, which is they have a vision for their business. They have a vision for what energy will be in the 21st century. And this vision, they are translating it into business opportunity. And in this stream, there is necessarily lowering the carbon intensity of our business models. And hence, it's value accretive, as you have said this morning. And the third point is that when you are a positively engaged organization, such as a GCI, when you try to work with as many stakeholders as possible, as we do try to, you start to learn about the languages of others. And you start to learn how to translate the languages of others. And Cara, you made that point very clearly earlier, which is your organization is about translating languages of many and trying to gather something which is meaningful by speaking the language of many, many different bodies, NGOs, financing institutions, policymakers, and companies. This is what we are trying to do at the GCI, and it's not that simple every day. Let's be practical. The fossil fuel industry is directly or indirectly, as Paul has shown us, in charge or responsible for 35 billion tons of CO2 emissions per year out of 50. So a big part of the problem and a big part of the solution, therefore. We are on a rhythm that is bringing us to 35 by 2030. So we are not going down, we are going up. In particular because India, Africa, South Asia, and so on, will emit more and more, whatever we say, over the coming 10 years. But we need to go down to 25 by 2030 to be at sync with the 2°C scenario, and to 20 to be at sync with the 1.5°C scenario. So we are going up to 35, if not more, 35 in a new policy scenario, and we need to go down to 25 at least. How can we do that? If we look simply at the last IEA World Energy Outlook scenario, and it is what it is, but at least it is a scenario, there are 5 or 6 levers on which we as an industry can have an impact and can work on and have to work on. And we try to do it collectively. One is energy efficiency. Not only our own energy efficiency, but making sure that when we look at a customer, whether that customer is a state, a city, an industry, or an individual, we first help that customer to have a lower footprint and to consume less before to provide him the energy he needs. So that's a little bit transforming our business models. The second one is about renewable. It's about increasing the share of renewable, in particular by decreasing the share of coal plants. Some of the companies at the GCI are engaged on that. Some of the companies at the GCI are not engaged on that. And I think it's a question of maturity, it's a question of what they can do and where they are on the stage. The third one is decreasing methane emissions. As we all know, methane emissions are a very important contributor to global warming and an incredible short-term solution, quick win on global warming. In September 2018, we have announced the first collective target of the oil and gas industry to reduce methane emissions from 0.32% in average in 2017 to 0.25% at least in 2025, aiming to 0.2% in 2025. So not a long-term ambition with a loosey target or a loosey goal, but a very precise target, collective target, to reduce by 1/3 our emissions by 2025. And the idea here is not only to do it for ourselves, but as well, now that we have a target, that we will report on it, that we will introduce reporting methodologies, that we will do that in transparency, to go and visit governments, NOCs, downstream players in the chain, partners, and influence them so as they do the same. Because if we do it, it will be a small chunk on that. Not because we are small, we are big, but interestingly, the GCI companies are among the best in terms of emissions. The average of our emission is 0.32%, when the average of the upstream players in the world is closer to 1%. So we need to influence the others. We need to lead by example, but influence the others wherever they are. The fourth one is kickstart the CCUS industry. And I will talk about that specifically today because it's a big problem. It's small here, but if we want to go to 1.5 degrees, it will be the biggest of all the bars. And I will specifically talk about this one because we have a big problem on this one. It's really, we need all the persons, all the bodies represented in this room and more to help us to kickstart this one. We will not be able to do it alone, and we want to do it for many reasons. And I will explain you the many reasons. And then, obviously, fuel switch, whether it is to nuclear, or whether it is to gas, or whether it is to renewable further. So, as a GCI companies, we have built roadmaps, detailed and precise roadmap on methane, on energy efficiency, on transportation efficiency, on CCUS, and on nature-based solution. Why are we starting to build a roadmap on nature-based solution, i.e. natural sinks, i.e. forest or mangrove or whatever? You may say, crazy, this is not their business. In fact, when you start to think about carbon sinks, negative emissions, you either have industrial carbon sinks, which is CCUS, or natural carbon sinks, which are nature-based solutions. If we want to help triggering the solutions and create businesses around that and offer our customers the ability to neutralize their emissions, we need to be able to understand the merit order at any point in time and provide the best solution at any point in time, anywhere where we can provide it, i.e. have a holistic approach between industrial and nature-based solutions. This is exactly what we are trying to start incubating among ourselves to understand what is the role we could play, when, how. And your views, your feedbacks on this would be very useful. Are we legitimate? Are we not legitimate? Should we or not engage, invest in this field in a holistic manner? CCUS specifically, I will accelerate. Look at the graph on the right. CCUS, we are going nowhere. So CCUS industry is 20 million tons of CO2 stored per year. If we want to be 2 degrees C compliant by 2030, or even 2040, we need to be at 2 billion tons of CO2 per year, according to most of the scenarios, including IPCC. If we want to be 1.5 degrees C scenario, we need to be at 6 billion tons per year of CO2 stored and captured by 2040, i.e. we need to have an industry by 2040, 50, almost as large as the oil and gas industry today, born by that day to do this, based on a commodity CO2 that has no value and no price today. So we need a value on CO2, we need a price on CO2. And we need to kickstart that industry. We are, as oil and gas companies, we don't want to do that for defensive reasons to remain alive. If we do this, it is to offer the ability to steel, cement, power to store their emissions. And therefore, we need to create a business opportunity. And why would we create it? Because we have the competencies, because it's about the same as our current business, but doing exactly the reverse. But if we are seen as doing it in a defensive manner, just as a survival kit, and if the policymakers, the NGOs, civil society, does not help us to find and to trigger the business models, we will have a hard time. We want to do it, we want to kickstart it, we are prepared to invest, we need to create the collaborative atmosphere to do it all together. Last but not least, we are trying to think at how we need to transform our industry. And this is part of the last OGCI annual report. We were born to produce energy, to transform it and to distribute it. The way we more and more look at our business models is we look at a customer, we help that customer to reduce its energy consumption or footprint. We provide then and only then we provide that customer the cleanest and the most affordable energy we can. Then we help that customer to pilot, aggregate, share its energy. Then, because we are in a circular economy world, we help that customer to look at his waste, whether that waste is heat, power, or CO2. CO2 is a waste. And we help that customer to value that waste, or to circle it back, or to store it or to neutralize it, and then to have a net positive impact. That's the way we are trying to rethink about our business models and look what we can contribute. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for a quick question. What was really inspiring is the collaborative approach that you've all come together, and also putting a spotlight on the need for carbon capture and nature-based carbon sink solutions, and how we might finance those, which is something we'll discuss after lunch. So a quick question? Maybe up front here?
Thank you. I'm Sagarika from PRI, and I'm very glad you have joined us on the island from which there is no escape. With that in mind, because you mentioned how the network and initiative you lead is CEO-driven, to what extent, as you have an industry perspective, do you believe the boards of major companies in your industry actually have competency in really understanding climate risk?
I don't know whether the boards have competency, but we can see that shareholders have more and more that competency. And I think what Paul shared with you this morning about this new shareholder resolution that has been put together or proposed to the BP board and accepted by the BP board, and you have that, I think, for most of the oil and gas companies across the world, shows that shareholders more and more have that competency, and boards are more and more inclined to, I would say, look at it positively and fight for them and propose them. So, and I think if you look at the last 2 years, you had substantially more of these proposals by shareholders that were accepted than refused. So I think it's a good sign. It's a necessary sign.
One quick question.
Jérôme, so don't worry, you will survive, you may even thrive. Quick question, I'm really very impressed and positively surprised by that strong commitment to carbon pricing on the CEO level. What level of carbon pricing dollar number are you actually targeting? Can you share some on this, maybe out to 2020, 2030?
You know, I think, first of all, I mean, as a GCI, we are not posting a specific carbon price. And each of the companies has. So what I could just tell you as a stakeholder, as if I was in the room, is that when I look at what oil and gas companies fight for as carbon price, you have anything in between 30 and 80. This is what I can see. And just for the sake of memory, for those who don't have that in mind, the current ETS price in Europe is at about 20. So it's at least 50% above.
Thank you, Jérôme. Thank you so very much for your inspiration.
Thank you.
And we're going to move right along to Herman Peng. Herman is the head of project management for e-fuels at Audi. So this is taking the conversation away from the oil and gas industry to the transport industry and how to shift that. So over to you, Herman. Please take the stage.
Thank you. Hello. I'm very honored that I have been invited again by Andrea to join this very precious meeting here. I really like the setting. I like that there are many experts that talk to each other. It's really great. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm, as it was said, more involved in producing renewable fuels. So Audi has built a so-called Audi e-gas plant in northern Germany that converts wind energy and CO2 to renewable methane and now also hydrogen and coming liquid natural gas for trucks, ships, and so on. So I'm not talking about this today. I dare to talk about something that I'm not an expert in, so I hope you pardon this, but I hope it's interesting for you. So what interested me is why do we have problems in stopping climate change? and we have big problems. I think it's the biggest problem we have, and we deal with it in the worst possible way. I say this really hard now because I think it's important to say that we are not on track to solve the problem at all. So let's look into the problem-solving process. We have a problem. If we don't stop the problem, it will kill us all, okay? So, do we have awareness? This is the first thing too. If we have a problem and don't have awareness, we don't do anything about the problem. Then, if we have awareness, we start modeling. This can be a very simple model, or it can be a very difficult model, like in climate change. Then we try to find measures by doing modeling. Then, if everything is fine on track, and if we can persuade all politicians to implement the measures, we will have legislation. And then, if we are lucky, the problem is solved. Of course, this is not linear. It's a complex system, and there are non-linear interactions, and there's iterative processes. Of course, not only the modeling process, but all processes can come and go and be repeated. But in general, this is the timeline in the problem-solving process. Okay. This worked very well sometimes in the past. The ozone layer problem, before and after. We started in '87, we were aware of the problem. There was the Montreal Protocol, forbid of all CFC, and today ozone hole is continuing to heal. Very efficient way of dealing with a very complex problem. Acid rain problem in Europe. This was '83. The fault of that was the sulfur and the nitrous dioxide from mainly coal-fired power plants. We implemented by law technology to stop it. Everybody complained of the coal industry. Nobody went bankrupt. Everybody is happy now, and nobody talks about it anymore because it's solved. Let's look at climate change. Awareness, a big problem. You know who said this? I don't have to tell the name. You know who said this. And it's not only you know who said this, it's a lot of other people who are not at all aware that climate change is the biggest problem we ever had in mankind. It can kill us all, and nobody understands, not the people who have to decide understand this deeply enough to really act. Because if they would maybe act. The thing is, there's a decoupled thing in modeling. It started in the '80s, and it's very proficient. We have the best climate models you can think of. There's a lot of people working it. The IPCC is bringing out reports not every year, every 5 years. And every time they outperform themselves because they have underestimated what they predicted. So they are too prudent. This is scientific prudent. It's good. They are scientists. They say, okay, on the one hand, this effect can occur. On the other hand, this can occur. Of course, there's a likelihood of this and that. And by, let's say, now they say it's very likely that we have to go below 1.5 degrees. If we don't, we're doomed. So this is not their fault. It's just the fault of people who tried to talk everybody else out of doing something. It's not their fault. They have the good models. They also have solutions. We have solutions for everything. We have solutions. We can get out of coal for a very cheap price. We can even get out of oil. Sorry for the oil companies. It's easy to get out of oil, in my opinion. It's not that easy at going out of coal, but it's possible. And we have a lot of other solutions, but they are not implemented. Now, let's look at legislation. So we know what to do. Reduce CO2, go below 2 degrees, maybe below 1.5. Now it's below 1.5. If we don't, we have the trigger points that will explode, and these are the little bombs that explode, and then you can't catch the system anymore. It's going to run away, and the economy is going to break down, and we are going to have a Mad Max scenario. And nobody really wants to know that this is happening. So, let's look at what could be done. Rockström and others proposed the global carbon law. It's already, again, not fast enough, but of course it's a very good idea to present it like this. So what is the idea behind it? Reduce emissions from 2020 at 100%, by 2030 by 50%, by 2030 by the next half, and here to the next half. Nowadays, the most ambitious IPCC scenarios go down here to 0. If we don't go to 0, as has been proposed before, we need CCS. The slower we go down, the more CCS we need. So it's going to cost. So why not let people who produce technology or buy technology, so customers, pay for additional measures if they are up here, and give them money if they have something below. This is sort of like, this is sort of like a line of equilibrium. It's like in thermodynamics, if you have a pressure volume diagram or a PT diagram. It's a line of equilibrium. If we are on the line, the system might stay in a sort of equilibrium so that we don't die. So let's look at the factual situation of legislation. The current CO2 pricing shows a completely non-efficient market. We have a price for OEMs, which I belong to, in fact, of 475 euro per ton. Why is this? Because the OEMs have to pay a penalty if their exhaust pipe emissions exceed a certain value by 2021. And if you calculate the CO2 amount that is reduced, this is 475. It's a good carbon price, by the way. I'm not against that, but of course, these guys should pay the same, or at least the double of what is here. This is, now it's at 20, as has been said, so 20 is nothing. This doesn't help at all. Why is, you know that in Germany there has been a negotiation about 1 year whether and when to go out of coal. The result is, let's go out of coal by 38. Good night, this is too late. And it would not cost a lot because the parity, if you substitute, if you simply take existing gas-fired power plants or build new ones and substitute the coal-fired power plants lignite, it will cost you about 50 euros per ton. Okay, it's not so much. The coal industry could be abate, if the coal industry would abate everything, it's 68 tons per year. Every year counts if you have this potential to reduce at low cost. Let's look at this table and compare the results of this inefficient legislation. The car industry electrifies everything at about 1,000 euros per ton at the moment. This is not a bad idea, it's a good idea because in 2050 we will have very efficient electric cars, but it's a bad idea to focus only on this and forget this. Look at the Google hits. If you type let's get out of coal, something like this, or let's do electric cars, you have 0.3 billion and you have 5.9 billion. Everybody's talking about electric cars. Nobody talks about exit of coal. This is a problem, awareness problem again. So legislation should be efficient. What needs to be done is you need to make a systemic evaluation. So this is, it's not easy to read this, of course, but it just should show you this is the current legislation. A limit of CO2 at the exhaust pipe will reduce the CO2, reduce oil imports, and reduce pollutants, local pollutants. This is true and very good. But if you don't look at the rest, you don't look at all. That is true. So if you have electric cars, you need to build lightweight materials which produces more CO2. You have battery production in China with coal, which produces more CO2. You have a dependency on battery and cell imports at the moment because we have to ramp up very quickly, so we can't build our own battery production because we slept for 10 years. That's true too, but now they ramp up in 10 years and this is too fast to be economical. And so we have social problems in mining like cobalt and lithium, and we can't solve the problems because we have to electrify with all means. With what result? We have coal electricity in Germany. and we are loading the electric car with coal, so we have a reduction in CO2 of maybe 20 to 30% at one car. So this is the problem. The solution is the following. The solution is the life cycle analysis needs to be taken into legislation. The life cycle analysis is a method to evaluate all environmental impacts of a technology, of a car, of a plane, of a factory, of everything. And it tells you all the truth about environmental impact. And so you start with vehicle manufacturing, where you have to produce the batteries or you have to produce the aluminum for the car. Here you have the fuel production, the indirect emissions, the methane emissions in the oil industry that were mentioned before are in here, in fuel production, indirect emissions of fuel production. It's a great thing to reduce the methane emissions in the fuel production, by the way. I was very impressed by that. Then come the exhaust pipe emissions. This is what everybody knows. And then there are some emissions in recycling. This is the current legislation. It's called tank to wheel. We need well to wheel, which is including the fuel production. And if we did that, we would see that a renewable fuel, like we produce in this plant, will reduce the emissions by 80% well to wheel, which is already not bad. And it's the same as we would load the electric car with wind energy. Of course, the best of all worlds is cradle to grave, where you also take into account the production of the goods you are selling or the services you are offering. And this needs to be implemented. Then we have a systemic legislation. We have tailpipe emissions measuring legislation, efficiency legislation, local pollutants, but also a cradle to grave assessment and sustainable value chains. Thank you very much.